What I'd like to do in this video is to talk with you about the scope of the project, what you're actually going to be producing at the end of your research. After you've learned about your slave or abolitionist, what is the timeline going to look like? And then also explain the organization of the note cards that you're completing as you're gathering information about the person you've decided to study. So first off, the end product is going to be a timeline. And on the timeline, there will be 5 major events from the abolitionist or slave's life that were turning points in their life. And the note cards are organized in such a way to help you to think about what those 5 events might be. After you complete these white bibliographic information note cards, you can move on to those 5 events. And you can see that they're organized by color. So here you can see event 1, followed by the number 1 long-term impact slide, the number 1 connection card, and the number 1 source. After you've completed that, then you can move on to the set of blue note cards for event 2 in the person's life. Then event 3, complete all the green note cards. Event 4, all of the yellow note cards, and finally, event 5, the red colored note cards. So when you're working on these note cards, you're going to be identifying some events in the person's life that stand out. You'll draw from the databases that you're reading and the print sources that you're reading, and you'll drop in a quotation from that source. That means that if you're on a database, you can copy and paste that information right here in the quotation. Now, after you dropped in the quotation, we're going to go over to the right, to the notes, and this is where you're going to summarize what you've learned about the event, that turning point in the person's life. In my example, I showed you in person for a lot of you, I showed you the example of Levi Coffin and how he had a turning point when he was very young, when he and his dad were working together out in the field, and they noticed that there were some African American men walking along a road, and they seemed to be downcast. They were chained together, and this young Levi Coffin turned to his dad and said, "What's happening?" And his dad explained that these were men who had been free, and they had been captured and they were taken to be sold in a slave market in the South. That was a major event in his life. It turned his life around, and from that point on, he knew that he wanted to fight against slavery because he knew it was wrong. So that might be an example of one event in a slave or abolitionist life. Then you're going to move on to the long-term impact slide. You're going to be thinking about how did this event really impact the person's life? And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go back to the example that I showed you in the timeline project note cards example. All right, so for the long-term impact, you can see that I've dropped in a quotation about the event that I just described. And over here in my notes, I've talked about the long-term impact of this event on Levi Coffin's life. And I wrote, this event, early in Coffin's life greatly impacted his future. He not only became an abolitionist, but was the leader of the Underground Railroad. This event, young in his life, had a huge impact on his life, and that's what I'm focusing on in this particular note card. Now, I'd like to skip back to the event 1 and show you that in my notes section, I wrote just a summary. I wrote, when Coffin was about 7 years old, he saw firsthand kidnapped men taken to a slave market to be sold. In large part because of this sad and interesting event, he became an abolitionist. So you can see here that this is just a summary of the event itself, but the long-term impact focuses on how did this impact Levi Coffin's life. The connection card is going to be a clear and relevant connection to one of the following. What I like about this card is that there's some choice for you. You can make a historical connection, an emotional or personal connection, or an event connection. A historical connection is described here. It says, how does this event remind you of another historical event? So you're comparing what happened in Levi Coffin's life as a young boy to another historical event that happened maybe during that time period, but maybe 100 years later. You could also make a personal or emotional connection. How does this event remind you of a situation in your own life? Is there any connection you can make to your own experience? The other choice is an event connection. What political or military event was taking place at the same time as this event in the slaves' or abolitionists' life? Now, for this particular note card, remember that you have a choice. You get to choose which connection makes most sense. This tends to be the note card that most people get hung up on, and it takes a while to get the connection, and that's okay. You might have to noodle on this for a while and have some conversation with other people to help figure out what the connection might be. Now, the source card is going to be relevant and compelling supporting information of one of the following. So again, you have a choice here. You can use a primary source. Remember, a primary source is materials from the actual time period, event, or created by a participant or a witness. Or you might choose a link to additional information about the event. In my example, I have a link to a website that I've pasted here. On the right-hand side, I've summarized what the website is all about. And I've written, this website, linked to here, presents detailed information about how African American children were kidnapped and made slaves. Do you see how that website connects back to the event? When Levi Coffin was just a little boy, he saw people kidnapped. They happened to be adults. But it was common during that time that African American children were kidnapped from the north and taken to the south to be sold. And so this website, linked to here, describes that. Really interesting connection there. So as you're working through your note cards and you're completing those color-coded sections, please be mindful that they should all connect. So the event has the same quotation over on the left as the long-term impact slide and the connection slide. If you have any questions, if you're not certain that you're on the right track, please stop by and ask me. It's always a good idea as you're working along through something, especially when you're new to it, to double check that you're doing it correctly. Feel free to stop by. If I'm not free, please email me, and we'll make sure that sometime throughout the day we can connect to make sure that you're on the right track and you feel good about the progress you're making.